Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 27th Annual Flanigan Lecture. I'm John Carney, President and CEO of the Center for Practical Bioethics. It's my honor to welcome you this evening in this virtual format once again. For the 27th year, we gather to honor one of the Center's most beloved teachers and mentors, Sister Rosemary Flanigan. This year, it's on the occasion of her 95th birthday. For all of her adult life, Sister Rosemary has demonstrated vocational commitment to ethics and education with a passion for justice. As a teaching nun, Sister Rosemary has invested her entire life in succeeding generations. Please view with me a video greeting from Sister Rosemary to all of us, recorded in a recent interview with Dr. Tarris Rosell, who serves as the Center's endowed chair for Sister Rosemary. Terry?
Years ago, the board at St. Joseph Hospital and the board at the center collaborated on establishing this lecture series, and I've been honored to have it named in my name. We have had wonderful topics, wonderful speakers, challenging issues. And today is going to be something very special. We're looking to the young for more reasons than one these days. And we're looking to the young to ask them about our involvement with them, preparing them to deal with ethical issues in medicine. Nobody's going to be looking forward more to what they say than I will, or that Terry and I will. I love it that I've had a piece to play in their professional development. And I hope that all their lives they will have mentors that will help them through all the rough spots in medicine. These are challenging times, and I just pray that they have the fortitude to accept the challenge. Thank you, Terry.
And thank you, Sister Rosemary. Well, we all have a mentor for the rest of our lives, certainly with her. And to teach, though each of you who've listened to this know how important she is in our lives. I hope she's inspired you as she has all of us, and that she will inspire you also to support the center and its work as we continue on our mission. Perhaps you'll even consider a gift of $95 in honor of her for her 95th birthday. If you so choose, you can go to our donate page on our website following tonight's presentation. Now I turn the stage over, and in this case, the screen, to Dr. Tarris Rosell. Terry.
Thank you, John. It's my privilege to welcome and introduce our speaker and panelists for this evening's event. The event is titled Young Physicians on the Frontline, Real-World Perspectives on Healthcare and Ethics During COVID and Beyond. And we will have with us on the Zoom screen this evening 5 relatively young physicians, all of them alums of Kansas City University and the dual degree program there, combining an osteopathic medical degree with an MA in bioethics. In July 2007, Sister Rosemary and I co-taught an introductory course in bioethics to the inaugural class of dual degree students at KCU. Turns out that this would be Sister Rosemary's last course of hundreds taught over many decades as a philosophy professor. So for this year's Flanigan event, we invited 5 of those students, now physician-ethicists of more than a decade. We invited them to reflect on practices of medicine and ethics during COVID and beyond. While planning this event a few months ago, we had anticipated a retrospective look at practicing medicine and ethics during a pandemic. As we all know, unfortunately, we are nowhere near beyond COVID as of August 2021. So it turns out that this is real world reflections in real time. I'm going to share the screen again and introduce our speaker and panelists. With us this evening is Dr. Andi Chatburn, who is the Regional Director for Ethics for Providence in Spokane, Washington. Dr. Erica Helgerson is in Family Medicine for Osceola Medical Center in Osceola, Wisconsin. Dr. Kirsten Brown does critical care and pulmonology for Allina Health in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Mike Schick is an emergency medicine physician at UC Davis Medical Center in Sacramento, California. And Dr. Charlene Murphy is in family medicine for Northwest Primary Care in Portland, Oregon. Our session will begin with a brief presentation by Dr. Chatburn, who will speak to us about triage grief and transformation. But just before Dr. Chatburn speaks with us, I want to introduce another colleague of ours, Dr. David Sine. Dr. Sine serves as the chair of the Department of Bioethics at Kansas City University, a position that he began just about the time a pandemic began back in January 2020. So David, thanks for being with us. Please bring us greetings from KCU, the alma mater of our 5 panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Rosell, and you are exactly right. I think the day I started, COVID arrived on our shores. So it's been an interesting year and a half as KCU has navigated how to run a medical school while all this is going on all around us. People ask me how we pull that off, and there is a great deal of attention paid to what we can deliver and how to deliver it. I often say that the ethics program at KCU has the easiest lift because so many of our programs are frankly virtual already, and we use talking heads to deliver content to our students. On the other hand, there are many people at KCU who face far greater challenges. Think about teaching anatomy or dissection virtually. I always say it must be a lot like teaching welding virtually, almost impossible. But thank you all for joining us tonight. As Terry has already said, we have 5 excellent ethicists to join us tonight as well. And I say they're excellent, but they're also made more so because they are among the very first to graduate from the Kansas City University dual degree program with a degree in bioethics. And then as that's not enough, this whole event is enriching because we have Dr. Rosell, who will lead the panel discussion. And as he has already mentioned, he was the initial chair of the bioethics department. So I look forward to this very much, learning from all of you and hearing Terry's presentation. So thank you on behalf of all the faculty at Kansas City University and all of our dual degree students, and in fact, all of our students, whether they're dual degree or not. Thank you for putting this on. Very much appreciated. Terry, my friend.
Thank you, Dr. Sine. Dr. Chatburn, talk to us.
Terry, thank you. Grief, borderlands, transformation. I'm going to share a piece of my own story, and and a new mentor that has entered my life while reflecting back on the information that Sister Rosemary has instilled in us along with Terry. In 2007, I, along with my cohort of budding bioethicists, is what we called ourselves, were enrolled in Sister Rosemary and Terry's class on Intro to Bioethics. And I remember the thing that sticks with me from that course is the duo saying over and over again, as we examined cases and history and conflict, was that ethics is about how we ought to be with one another in community. And if we boil all of those other questions down, at the heart of it, we have humans sitting with other humans who are here, like it or not, with one another in community. And that continues to serve me well to this day, along with in this pandemic. I remember right after I joined the center as an intern, I think I let you know that I was going to be an intern. I don't think there was an application process. I think I let you know that that was what I was going to do. And it just showed up whether you wanted me there or not. And that summer, I remember sitting in the auditorium of St. Joseph Care de Lay Hospital, which was right along I-35 and the Kansas-Missouri state border. Linda and Zeke Emanuel each spoke. Linda about ethics and palliative care and the moral obligation to provide palliative care to patients who are at the end of their lives. Zeke about politics and pandemics. And I was drawn in to the intimacy and the spiritual, just the spiritual nature of palliative care at the end of life, and knew that that was something that I wanted to spend my life doing. Knew that I needed this degree because every day of my life, something would arise that had an ethical nature to it. Zeke's presentation left me a little more disturbed, I'll be quite frank, frightened even, at the possibility of a future pandemic. Little did I know, we were on the verge of the 2009 flu pandemic. And I certainly didn't realize that 14 years later, I would be working as a full-time bioethicist at the intersection of both end of life and pandemic ethics. Today, I'm joining you virtually because to be quite frank, we have yet another surge of COVID. I'm sitting in Spokane, Washington at the border of Idaho and Washington, who have quite different politics and policies around public health. This surge has affected our hospitals to the point of being on the brink of crisis, if not having dipped our toe into crisis care over and over again over the course of the last 2 to 3 weeks, which is nothing new. New York saw this, LA last winter, and the nation today. I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted after being in the midst of this situation for 18 months of constant uncovering of layer after layer of the devastating realities that, quite frankly, have existed for decades and longer, and yet they're revealed in this moment. The insufficiency of our safety net systems and health insurance systems, the violent systemic white supremacy of the criminal legal system. I'm no longer calling it the justice system. It's not in my lexicon any longer. And the prognostic impacts that social determinants of health have on the people who are in our lives and the people that we meet within our clinics, hospitals, and through telehealth. All of this on top of the damage that, in my opinion, the individualist view of autonomy that ruled the 90s is wrecking on a health system dependent on communities who recognize one another as interdependent and having a common humanity. And that's where my story comes in. About a year ago, in the midst of the ramping up of the presidential election, the ongoing conversation about the pandemic, masking the hope of a vaccine, whether or not we were going to travel and be with one another as a family. What I found myself doing after a particularly ugly social media encounter, in which I will own my pieces of, I officially broke up with my family of origin, finding myself on the divide, of feeling as though my living family members were no longer alive and accessible to me. I imagine that many others have been not only in that position, but in the position of actually having lost family members from tragedies, natural causes, and COVID. The grief that sits within my body, not only today, but a year ago, at the height of the winter surge, felt and at times feels like a weight that takes me down to the very bottom of the ocean. The image that kept coming to me was the image of going to where light and life no longer exist. And in that discovering, and this is discovering, and go with me, that warmth and community and love absolutely existed in that place. Just like the tectonic plates shift and the heat vents come up, giving life to communities of tube worms and other organisms that thrive where life otherwise was not able to live, I found myself going back to, in these waves of grief, in the wake of my family split after the July 6th insurrection, in every single triage team practice that I led, having a state public health outline that guided hospitals in practicing with administrative triage teams that were and or are to make decisions about who is admitted to the hospital and who is not, who is on the ventilator, who is not, who is discharged with a safe enough versus a not safe enough discharge back to their communities, whether there is a community to receive them or not. And with each wave of grief, that image of being in the depths of the deep, surrounded by heat and a community that also knew grief. A community which wasn't accessible to myself earlier, to others who are not in the depths of the deep, of the bottom of the ocean. And as grief crashed wave after wave, moment after moment, in these scenarios, another image started to emerge. I've never shared a dream when I've been teaching or lecturing, and I'm gonna go out on a limb tonight and share that with you, but not yet. Within my own family, within the hospitals I support that are both in urban centers and in rural critical access outposts, we are as diverse as we have ever been. And instead of embracing in solidarity the beauty that can come from learning from one another as we learn curiously about one another. We are pushing apart further and further, and we are not just divided, not just on a chasm of two parties and camps looking at one another, warring groups within a country separated by political loyalty, medically by beliefs about vaccination, geographically by that rural-urban divide, which is increasingly gaping, religiously and spiritually. We're divided, with our communities rupturing, our families separating, and on and on. And rather than being divided in two in that chasm image, the image that's here is a shattering from an infinite number of positions within a circle, each one of us holding a set of life experiences, a set of beliefs, a set of experiences, a set of educational loyalty, trust, and emotional pieces that are within us, all looking into the center of the circle within which we are connected to one another with those millions of infinite viewpoints, looking into that gaping hole and imagining that we are separated as though we are two, and we are not. The dream. So, long story short, I found myself suturing in this dream. I have, after training as a family medicine physician and then doing a fellowship in palliative care, I have not sutured in about 10 years and never plan to again. And in this dream, as I tried to convince, I was in this dream, I had come up to a border agent. I was crossing a border of some kind. Came up to a border agent, tried to conceal my identity as a bioethicist for some reason. And they knew that I was a family physician already. And so they took me into a place where I was to suture an individual who was angry and had been pulling their sutures apart, had a large abdominal wound. And within that large abdominal wound, that gaped, you could see where sutures had been placed over and over and over. And I was one more person asked, in fact, demanded to suture this back together. The patient, certainly we could go into all of the consent pieces, that's an ethics issue in and of itself, but the patient themselves demanded that the sutures be done without pain medication. And with each stitch, the patient yelled in pain, blaming, saying, "Why on earth are you doing this to me? Now do it again. Why on earth are you doing this to me?" And do it again. And as the dream progressed, there was not only not enough suture for this large abdominal wound, but the suture kept breaking over and over again. And eventually, as I get to the end of the dream and I'm waking up, it was immediately apparent that you cannot heal with thread. Only love can heal. And although there's plenty of things in our world currently that are healed with thread, and I don't want to discount my surgical colleagues in any way, shape, or form, but in the brink of this divide, we cannot heal anything with thread. Only love can heal. I was introduced to Valerie Kaur, an attorney, civil rights activist. She creates documentary films. She's a theologian, and recently wrote a memoir that came out in June of 2020 called "See No Stranger," a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love. As I read Valerie's book and stories, and wondered how it applied to not only my own situation within my family, but within healthcare, as we increasingly get ethics consults around non-therapeutic relationships, where patient is angry, family is angry. Most recently, our physicians are angry with our full ICUs and of unvaccinated patients. And what she has taught me over the course of the last year is that we must begin to see one another, especially those with whom we are, those whom are our enemies. She describes enemy as an individual that it is difficult to, or if not impossible, to be curious about. And if we can see that individual not as a stranger, not as someone that's across either a chasm of a divide or a divide within a circle, all looking into the pit of our divisiveness, but instead seeing that individual as not only an individual worthy of love, who has been deeply hurt and broken throughout their lives, but as a part of me that I do not yet know. It wasn't until a month after the January 6th insurrection when I first watched the videos of that event, and I was afraid that I was going to see one of my brothers on the screen, present and there. As I listened to Valerie share her story about forgiving and going through a process of truth and reconciliation, so that with not only her own attacker, but also with the murderer of one of her uncles, and as she said, I was finally able to see them as a part of myself that I did not yet know. A month after that insurrection, I was able to start seeing my own family of origin as a part of me that I clearly did not yet know. The role of bioethics on the brink of this wave of the pandemic and in our divided country is not in leading triage teams. It's not in allocating life-sustaining interventions or staffed hospital beds, which are getting rarer and rarer, but it's on seeing no stranger within our own story and bringing in the revolutionary love that comes with that common humanity and interconnectedness that exists but is invisible at this point among the shattered landscapes of our communities. We will rebuild this. We will rebuild our healthcare system and our communities and the criminal legal system. And the pandemic, like other borderlands, offer a moment to grieve deeply, so deeply that we get to the place where we are surrounded by a community of love in a way that is not available in places other than deep grief. This grief is a portal for transformation, and it's a transformation that we desperately need. I don't know how we'll get there, but I know that within my own life, and I know within the hospitals that I serve, that as I meet more and more divisiveness, having a moment to care for myself so that I can be curious about another and learn how they too are a part of me that I do not yet know is the only way that I know how to take one step in front of the other.
Thank you, Dr. Chatburn. You have definitely given us a lot to think about, to feel, and also to discuss, which is what we have opportunity to do now for the next 45 minutes or so. Adding now to the dialogue, Drs. Brown, Helgerson, Murphy, and Schick. And again, I want to say welcome to all of you. And thank you again so much for agreeing to share your real world perspectives on healthcare and ethics during an ongoing COVID pandemic. And now I'm going to go off script just a little bit. I will get to the question that I had said I would ask you, but I want to move immediately now to thinking about what Dr. Chatburn has just shared from your heart, from your own life story. And I want to ask the rest of you, do any of you experience grief as a primary emotion or a dimension of your practice of medicine and ethics during these times? Do you feel exhaustion? Are you experiencing the divisiveness that requires some kind of transformation, perhaps through love, by way of grieving also? Any of you, the other four of you panelists, want to speak to what you're experiencing in this regard?
Andi, first of all, thank you for sharing that. That was absolutely beautiful. And I think it brought, at least for me, some hope that I haven't really felt in a while. So I think I needed to hear that as well. I guess I didn't think of it as grief, but now that I've heard Andi speak, I think that's exactly what I've been feeling. It feels like kind of a long, traumatic, slow burning nightmare that will never end. And I feel like stress hormones are running high. There's a lot of burnout. I'm in family medicine. There's a lot of burnout in my specialty, as well as other specialties. And I think grief is exactly, what I've been feeling. So I think Andi hit it right on the head there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again, Andi. That was fantastic. And I think that that's kind of the nature of the intensive care unit, is how do we forge ahead to care for chronically ill, for the most part, and acutely ill patients, and get the job done and worry about our emotions afterward. And that's been laced with angst since we were creating a plan and implementing, and I can go into that more. But so I think the grief for myself comes from the angst of trying to be as prepared to take care of as many people as we can, and then realizing that I've made a choice to be in Minnesota and my family is predominantly in Michigan. So, and being here alone. So how do I connect outside of wonderful colleagues? How do I have that familial connection and keep everyone I love safe in the interim?
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
I would also add, being a primary care physician and spending appointment after appointment with my long-term patients, I am also experiencing their grief. And so when you see up to 25 patients a day, hearing their stories, it's hard. And it makes me want to forge ahead, like Kirsten said. And so taking my time after clinic to be able to rejuvenate and find the hope is just important, because the days are long. We're all feeling it.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say we're all feeling grief in different ways. And I think I've been feeling grief, for my patients, first of all. I mean, I work in the emergency department, so see people who are critically ill, people who are dying, people who have had to say goodbye to careers and loved ones, and their lives have been, changed in many different ways. And my own life as well, as all of our lives have changed. And so I think grief around how our medical system has crumbled and how our medical education system has suffered, the way we used to teach, the way we used to live our lives, had to say sort of goodbye to those things, and with the hopes of them returning, but that hasn't happened yet. And career wise, we use these words like burnout and things like that, but it does feel almost like an end, or a grieving process of my own career as well, because I certainly go into work every day wondering, well, not sure how far I can go with this. And that's like a daily sort of conversation I have with myself. And it's really an unknown. I'm feel that at present, I'm like, I'm going to stick it out to the end of COVID. And at that point, I'm going to think about what I'm going to do next. But that's how I feel today.
Thank you. In the chat, and I hope you all are following the chat, there's a comment thanking Andi for referencing the Buddha's wisdom. Hatred can never overcome hatred. Love alone can do that. And you did talk a lot about grief, about divisiveness, about family of origin losses, anger. But you also mentioned love. Do you want to say anything more about that, Andi, or any of the rest of you, as you think about, we talked a lot about that in our faith communities, if we're a part of faith communities. And you are, I know that, Andi, but not everyone is. So talk to us a little bit more about love as some sort of antidote.
I'm not sure that it's an antidote, only that anger and rage and love and grief all exist together. Bob is a dear mentor of mine and led me to medicine and bioethics. And thank you, Bob. It's so good to see your name, and you are part of my family of choice. The love shows up in all wisdom and faith traditions. Valerie Kaur, who I referenced, is sick, excuse me, and she talks about the warrior sages and Guru Nanak, who taught her that that rage and anger are because we're protecting what we love, and joy is how we experience love in community. And within my own faith community, I confess that as a lay minister within a small Christian denomination, that's another piece of divisiveness in my life right now, and have recently resigned my own priesthood, knowing that love can be found in all faith traditions, but also knowing that there's a lot of complexity in our human communities right now as well.
A nurse ethicist on the chat thanks you and then says this: so many people have been lost because of COVID, even if they never had COVID. The isolation, the separation, the conflict is real. We've had to find family in all sorts of ways. And one of my very good, close colleagues, ethicist, physician, messaged me privately. I won't identify her, but she says that she knows at least a half a dozen doctors who have reorganized, scaled back, or stepped back from practice just this past year. And I suppose I see some nodding of heads that you all have known of physicians for whom this has just been too much. Another question in the chat is moral injury part of grief? Moral injury is another concept, whole books written about that. But do any of you want to respond to that? Do you think of what you're experiencing as something like moral injury? We'll let that rest, and we might come back to that.
Well, I'll just comment that, I mean, I know the term moral injury, and I understand what it means, but I think, well, at least for me, I think a lot of physicians feel the same way, that sort of duty that we felt to take care of patients and take care of society, it's somewhat been at odds at times with our personal safety and the way that we feel that society has reacted to the threat of COVID and to taking care of itself. And so the moral injury of feeling like we haven't protected each other, and that, you know, our duty to help has been at odds with keeping our family safe and ourselves safe has been quite challenging. I think that's one thing that has contributed to perhaps grief, but also physician burnout.
And some other comments in the chat reference depression and other testimonies to all of these various emotions and experiences that have been mentioned. So now let me get back to my script, at least, and ask you another question. It's been 14 years since we met over in that KCU classroom with Sister Flanigan and studied the basics of bioethics. So I'm wondering what you all have learned since then as physician-ethicists, maybe especially during pandemic times, but for the 8 or 9 years prior to that, what is it that you learned of ethics interest since we gathered together as a class? And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Brown, because you are in the critical care area, which is where a lot of our COVID patients end up. But even before then, anything that you're learning of ethics interest from critical care?
Well, I always have to thank my emergency physician colleagues for getting the patients to me. So I think goals of care is always a conversation that is dire once someone gets to the intensive care unit. I also practice an outpatient adult pulmonary, so I have chronically ill patients there where I try to start the conversations. When there's no pandemic, having cohesive goals of care can be challenging, and then meeting folks at the brink of intubation, realizing that at this time when their lungs are confluent, infiltrates the, they're very hypoxic, realizing that this may be the last time they get to see anyone and it's going to be their healthcare providers is devastating. So how to have an in-depth conversation around that, their wishes. I mean, most people wish to live and want us to do everything, and realizing that's not a realistic goal at that point for them. And how do you have a thoughtful conversation when you have maybe 2 minutes to do that in? and how to try to focus on which pillar of bioethics do you focus on in that moment. Realizing there's the social justice piece, the autonomy, the do no harm, and try not to be paternalistic. When we are the experts, we know how this is typically going to go, and realizing that what we say to our patients carries significant weight, and they do rely on us to be honest with them, and how to navigate all of that in a few moments has really been challenging.
So you mentioned the 4 big principles, and we probably emphasized in that classroom 14 years ago respect for patients' autonomy, at least as much as anything, and we probably emphasized distributive justice as well, given who Sister Rosemary and I are, but now we have a public health emergency. Do you find yourself vacillating a little bit on the respect autonomy principle relative to some other ones?
I have that internal dialogue, certainly. A couple of weeks ago when I was in the intensive care unit, we had a call from Oklahoma. And at first I thought maybe there was an obscure hospital somewhere in Minnesota, but it was the state of Oklahoma looking for an ICU bed because they couldn't find anything closer. And so it's almost like a splitting in a way to cope, that I find that how do we have to accept the responsibility at this point for those that have chosen to be unvaccinated, and then we as the health system are expected to do everything at that point when I have feelings that the patient hasn't done anything for themselves. But you could then argue that in most chronic illnesses, and having the divide of now you're taking an ICU bed from someone who has a splenic artery rupture, and how do I care for that patient who doesn't have COVID, and or those that are vaccinated but have underlying autoimmune diseases or cancer, and they have tried to prevent this illness. So I'm realizing that's a coping mechanism that I have to try to say this is right, this is wrong, right? An internal dialogue to, that doesn't make it helpful necessarily in caring for patients, but it makes it a reality of something that I have to contend with and try having those thoughtful conversations with their loved ones if they're not able to speak for themselves.
So you're on one end of of the healthcare spectrum there when patients end up in critical care ICU, but on the front end, Dr. Helgerson and Dr. Murphy, you're seeing your patients before all that happens, and hopefully it doesn't happen, but sometimes it does. We've been saying that in the effort to get people to agree to vaccination and to wearing masks and other things that are preventative, that their primary care physician is the person they most trust. Is that what you have learned in the last decade of primary care? Is that these patients trust you when they don't maybe trust me?
I would like to say that is true. And I do think that for the most part, that's a true statement. Although I would be lying if I didn't say that the pandemic, I feel, has brought on sort of a divide or a chasm between me and some of my patients that I think I had built up a pretty good relationship with over the past 8 years in practice here. So that's been a little discouraging as well. But this pandemic has taught me that autonomy runs deep in American culture, more than I think I wanted to admit prior to this whole thing. And so I'm sort of trying to use my place in the world as a primary care physician to just do what I can, because although I do practice in the hospital, we're a critical access medical center, so we don't have an ICU. Our patients who need critical care get transferred to hospitals in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for accepting my patients when they come your way. And so I think, what can I do on the front end? And I think family medicine is great to dealing with prevention. So the vaccine has been one area that I've tried really hard to talk to every patient 12 and older about, whether or not they've had their vaccine or not. I bring it up with every patient. And I think that autonomy is tricky, right? Because for someone to make a good decision for themselves, they need to have all the information. They need informed consent. And I think with the misinformation we're seeing, and elected officials spouting misinformation, and people hearing it from social media and wherever else they might get their news unreliably, our job is to kind of bring that back home and say, this is what we actually know. And then also be honest about what we don't yet know. So these are things that we know about the vaccine. These are things we know about COVID. Yes, there's some question marks here and here, and I'm admitting that because I want to continue to have the trust from my patients. And some of my patients have gotten the vaccine. They might still have questions about the booster or how to convince a family member to get the vaccine. A lot of my patients, I'm in rural Wisconsin, a lot of my patients also don't want the vaccine. I try to still ask, even though it's hard and I don't want to most days, I still ask, what their reasoning is, and are there questions that I can answer? And these are the risks of COVID long-term that we know about, and there's probably more coming. And so I think risk and benefit and your health conditions, this is something to consider. And sometimes they change their mind, sometimes they're on the fence, sometimes they're not. I get nasty comments at least a few times per day, but I've decided that this is my duty, my ethical duty as their primary care physician, to just keep bringing this up even when it's hard.
Sorry for the nasty comments. You don't ever deserve anything nasty, Dr. Helgerson. Dr. Murphy, do you ever think about maybe sending out a letter like a Dr. Valentine did down in Alabama the last few days, or at least was thinking about doing so, saying, look, if you don't get vaccinated, I'm not sure I can be your primary care, your family practice doc anymore?
I have personally not felt like I could make a statement like that. Practicing in Portland, Oregon, there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy even prior to COVID. And it is hard to sort of isolate a large group of individuals off of something like that. Because at the end of the day, my goal is to provide high quality, evidence-based primary care to everyone. And I do feel like everyone deserves that. I try to be as honest and upfront with people. So it would be very hard for me to have a letter like that go out. And more gumption to people, I guess, who do it, and they're really trying to live by their values. Yes, and I will say that we also get a lot of poor Google reviews or lots of social media reviews about trying to recommend vaccines. And so that's also very, very challenging to get those things.
So then they show up in the ER, Dr. Schick. What ethics issues are you encountering there, thinking about at that point?
Well, as everyone was talking, it actually triggered a memory of Sister Flanigan. And so I thought, it's kind of informed my ethics for my entire life. You were there as well. We were all 14 years younger, but I can't remember the details of the scenario, but we used to talk ethical scenarios often. And I think you kind of see what we come up with, and then we go back and forth, and you could try to educate us on how to think about these things. The scenario was something about an elderly patient being discharged from the hospital, or wanting to be discharged from the hospital, but perhaps it was too early for the patient to be discharged. But they had capacity to make their own decisions, and they wanted to go. So what were we to do in that scenario? And I think the majority of us said, well, the patient has autonomy to make their own decisions, so they're gonna go home. And then I remember Sister Rosemary, miming a race car and pretending she was in the race car. And she said, I feel like you guys are in the race car and there's no brakes on the race car and you're driving this person home. And I think she was trying to illustrate that, there's not just autonomy at play here. There's other considerations, like, public safety and justice and things like that. So I try to think about the balancing of these things in every sort of encounter that I have. And I think about her actually when I do that. And so in the emergency department, I mean, we have similar issues that have already been highlighted, but it's a little bit different because I only see people for a very microsecond of their lives. So I'm probably less successful at getting people to be vaccinated. We have a vaccine available in the emergency department for people to get. And when I know they're not vaccinated, I offer it to them. But I've probably seen in the last 12 months, maybe 1,500 patients, something like that. And I think I've given the vaccine to 5 people. So it's not very effective getting it through the emergency department, although you'd think that would be a good way to access the vaccine. The first thing that we really, I think, were hit with early in the pandemic was just, like I said before, like the duty to serve our patients and how we were going to do that safely. We had not enough PPE, protective equipment. We were trying to figure out how to intubate, how to put, invasive airways in patients. And we were coming up with all sorts of devices to try to do it safely, which in retrospect seems kind of silly. We created like plexiglass boxes to put the patients in so that we could try to intubate them safely. And I'm sure Dr. Brown had similar experiences. And so we were really worried about their safety, our personal safety, spreading the virus, infecting more of the community and our own families. And so that was the major thing up front. And we sort of got past that and we got more equipment. And now we're sort of through that window. But the next thing that hit us immediately was, a social justice problem where some were getting the vaccination, some weren't. Some people were dying, many times faster and getting sicker than the rest of society. These marginalized populations and patients that we knew, were going to get hit harder than everyone else. It happened. And so we were trying to scramble in Sacramento, in my department, try to vaccinate people in specific areas that we knew were going to get sick and die faster than other populations. And wasn't easy to penetrate those populations. And we're finally sort of making headway. And now I think we're in this space where we're struggling with mandates. I mean, there's no other way to say it, but like, we're trying to mandate vaccinations on different levels in corporations and health centers and dealing with the ramifications of that politically within our own departments and our own hospitals. And the moral injury, I think, is even more acute now, because when you have people who you work with, nurses, techs, other doctors, perhaps, or just people in your community that would rather, not be vaccinated, rather go to another hospital, another system than to be vaccinated. It's a difficult thing to deal with. And we'd rather retain people than let them go because we need everyone. So that's what we're struggling with now.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Schick, I want you to say just a brief word too. I know you have a global perspective and a global vision for healthcare. You, at least pre-COVID, did a good bit of traveling to other parts of the world with much, much fewer resources than we have here. What compels you to do that?
Yes, that's true. So I'm comfortable working in places like Uganda and Laos and Nepal. And when I started medicine, I wanted to kind of take care of those who are most in need. And I grew up in the United States, so this is kind of where I mostly work, but I wanted to branch out and see what else I could do and how else I could help. So that's kind of where my global work started from. It's been, frustrating is really not the right term, but it's sort of painful, maybe is a better term, to watch colleagues around the world get hit with COVID and not have the same resources that we have here. So we think we're bad, that we're bad off. It really doesn't compare to places that don't have oxygen. It's in places like that I wanted to make an impact, and it's been hard not being able to help them.
Thanks for what you do, Dr. Schick, in some of those other places of the world with even fewer resources. I want to shift just a little bit here. Dr. Chatburn is now doing clinical ethics consultation, directing that, and teaching others, as Sister Rosemary and I did with you all 14 years ago. And I'm wondering if over the past decade and a little more of practicing medicine, if there's something that you wish that we would have covered that we maybe didn't back then in your ethics education and training, or something, Dr. Chatburn, that you have incorporated into your ethics education that maybe was missed back when you were in school.
I want to loop back to moral injury and moral distress that was mentioned in the comments, because I think that comes up every time we do ethics education, whether it's ethics grand rounds or whether it's a workshop or whether it's for some of our consultation ethics champions and ethics committee members. Elizabeth Epstein and the late Anne Hamrick talked about moral distress, moral injury, and the crescendo effect that it has. And it wasn't something that I remember talking about during our bioethics master's program, but I think partly because it was just emerging as a term at that time, and it wasn't something that was really a part of an embedded curriculum. And it's something that I think affects every topic and every piece of the medical system and medical care and ethics. And what they describe about the crescendo effect is that with every encounter where there's moral distress, and someone asked to define moral distress and moral injury. So moral distress is when when a caregiver, especially a professional who has a code of ethics and their own personal beliefs, and they often work within a nonprofit or a faith-based organization that has its own set of core values, they're being asked to do something that violates one of their own personal core values. And it's required because of respect for persons and respect for autonomy, or because of social justice and the reality of scarce resources, and any number of things. And when we're not addressing those moments and those, and Kirsten, I don't want to misquote you, but I mean, what I heard you describe is, I mean, many moments throughout a given shift or a given week that pile up that you have to bracket or use some coping mechanisms to put that aside for a moment so that you're able to do your job. And when we bracket that without being able to come back to that and care for ourselves on after that moment, or when another moment interrupts it again and again and again, what they find is this crescendo effect of moral injury, and they use the description of layers of paint on an old house. I have a house that was built in 1941, and there are many layers of paint, and they describe that after layer after layer after layer after layer building up without addressing it, without caring for, without not only the environment to make it safe to care for oneself from a mental, emotional, and as a mental, emotional, and spiritual being, we eventually have to end up scraping it off with a paint scraper or worse. And so care for the caregiver and self-care as not as something that we do when we go home or something separate or something that we're supposed to do as professionals or a spa day, but self-care as an inherent part of the work that we do, because what we do is bearing witness to so much suffering, is part of every element of what I've incorporated into bioethics education.
Thanks. Anyone else? We did not talk about moral injury. I'm quite sure 14 years ago, because I'd never heard of it until sometime after that. Yeah.
I think we're seeing social media and the use of technology in ways that we would have never envisioned 14 years ago. And so I'll be very curious to see how that's brought in to training, especially around distrust and misinformation. And it can actually be used for good. I have seen that happen where physicians or providers are able to connect with someone in their field and make something remarkable happen. But we also have seen how this has been a great divide. So I'll be curious to see how that's brought into training.
Good, thank you. Anything else any advice that you have for those of us who are still teaching bioethics?
I think bringing in real world physicians, some capacity to talk to the students and help lay out some different scenarios, real world scenarios, and how those were addressed, whether it was at an M&M or with their own ethics committee, is very insightful.
Thank you.
I second that and maybe go further. I was gonna say, put the students on ethics committees in hospitals close by, because I think the theory that you get is 100% necessary, but you gotta apply it, and you have to be on the sort of forefront of it, because they're going to get dropped in as interns and not know, a little bit hard to put all this to use, I think, without practice. So I think if you can put them on there and get them started early, get to know some of that, I think, hidden curriculum that is in the hospital, they'll be well served.
Good idea. Anyone else? And Dr. Sine, if you're still with us, or John Carney, either of you have questions for our panel or clarifications? John writes in the chat.
Terry, I just made a note in the chat about how I'm struck by the level of personal humility and discernment that everybody who's spoken tonight, it's kind of an affirmation of Richard Payne. Dr. Richard Payne used to talk about epistemic humility, that we have to come to grips with what we know and what we don't know and move forward with the knowledge that we have, even in times of uncertainty. And that discernment process isn't always clear, but these are tough times. And even Rosemary, I would probably guess, would say she's never lived through anything like this. She's written me that numerous times, that she prays every day for all of us, but especially those of you in health settings.
I've especially enjoyed the discussion about what these very experienced journeyman ethicists would recommend that needs to be included in the teaching of ethics. That I've made a lot of notes here. Thank you for your input on that. It's excellent. And I'd like to share with you something that one of our students, and don't our students always say the smartest things ever? One of our students said to me about public health recently, which was, she felt that public health was having its Sinclair Lewis moment. And I thought that was brilliant and right on target as well. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think both of you, Dave and John, express, with some emotion too, what I also experience with each of the 5 of you from that class 14 years ago, and the medical residents that I meet with every week, and medical students elsewhere, is you all give me so much hope. But because of the epistemic humility and and you're just so smart and you're so kind and compassionate for your patients, for their families, for your communities, and for the world. But even when I say that, I recognize that may put another burden upon you to do what I and my generation have not done as well as we had hoped. And so I asked you also to reflect on another question before we get to the end of our time. I asked what hopes and fears the 5 of you have, or maybe dreams and maybe nightmares that you have as you look beyond this pandemic. Someday we'll get beyond this to probably, hopefully, decades of doctoring and ethics practice yet to come. Hopes, fears, dreams that you have, nightmares that you experience.
I hope that we can all recognize that societies stand on the shoulders of public health. And that, I love how eloquently Andi put it, how we are coming and meeting people and seeing sides of ourselves we haven't yet experienced too, is another way to understand and learn from each other.
I guess my hopes that I had thought about was more personal, which is just to find ongoing and evolving passion in medicine, especially in primary care, to stave off burnout or moral injury, or however to say it, just to continue to serve the people of my community in an engaged way. And I think a great fear I've been seeing and sort of feeling like it's coming to realization is just this distrust of physicians in this career that I've, at this point, almost 150,000 hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars to get. I don't want it to be ridiculed. And so really at the end of the day, I, strive to have comprehensive, contextual, accessible, patient-centered care, and just want to keep doing that, trying to figure out how to do that.
I guess mine is a little bit more personal too, but I'm hoping that I can continue to hold on to these glimmers of humanity that I see in my patients, despite us sometimes not seeing eye to eye on some of these really important issues, and seeing them as people, and maintaining that relationship that we had built up until this point, and that I hope we'll build for years to come, and that we can all be a little bit more humble, a little bit more vulnerable, and a little bit more open to the idea that we don't have all the answers. So I think that's what I've been personally working on. That helps me find a little bit of hope in all of this, is not feeling so righteous and I have all the answers, but a little bit more from other people would be helpful too.
Well, I don't want to end on a negative note or anything, but I guess my fear and my hope, was to, not only for this pandemic to end, but for not only our health system, but our society to come together in some way and make some positive changes, not just in public health, but in the way our whole system functions. And I don't see that happening. right now. And so my fear is that we will muddle through this and there won't be any big changes that happen that should be happening. And so I hope that's not true. We're trying to make change where I'm at, but we need it on a larger scale. So.
Thank you. I'm going to read just a couple of comments in the chat as we end. One is from Rachel Wright, who is a 5th-year med student in UMKC's 6-year School of Medicine. And Rachel, you say you're vice president of a student organization for bioethics. Good for you. And that students are always looking for opportunities to be more involved in bioethics. We're eager to learn and influence the future of medicine. Thank you for that. And I hope you get in touch with us at the Center for Practical Bioethics, as well as relating to our really good colleagues over at UMKC. Thanks for what you do. And then Leslie, clinical ethicist colleague, writes, thank you for being on the meeting, Leslie. Notes that her ethics committee talked about some of these issues earlier today. And you write, there's such a sense of judging and being judged. We talked about how important it is to treat each other with respect and to realize how our own biases can impact our interactions with one another. Being able to approach this with or from love is a different and moving way to look at this. Thanks to Andi. I really appreciate this perspective, Leslie writes. It may be how we gracefully get through this with some small sense of we're in this together. It's hard to hang on to, though, at times, and looking at this from the perspective of grief. Grief for the relationships we used to have, for the safe spaces we used to know, for the things that won't be the same as they used to be. This is really important. Thank you all. And I want to say thank you to all of you, to Dr. Chatburn for a stimulating talk, which was so very good. I'm glad we recorded this, Andi. Thank you, Dr. Schick, Dr. Murphy, Dr. Brown, Dr. Helgerson, each of you for coming online this evening from your places throughout the nation. It has been fun to recreate that KCU classroom of 14 years ago. Thank you so much. Thanks to my center and KCU colleagues, John Carney, David Stein. David, I want you to know that I've been drinking from my KCU, what is this? It's not a mug, but my drinking thing. And we do appreciate KCU as a partner in many things. Thank you to our center colleagues, to Polo, to Ryan, Cindy, Jan, Kay, Monica, Erica, Matthew, Lindsay, Trudy. Thanks to each of you for your collaborations on this event and all of the things that we do together. I have the best colleagues anywhere. Thank you, Sister Rosemary Flanigan, for having a 95th birthday. Usually we would sing happy birthday, but we won't try to do that. It does not work well on Zoom. I've tried. Thank you for inspiring younger generations to follow in your footsteps, Sister Rosemary, of ethics, of education, of working for justice in healthcare. Thanks to each of you who support the work of the center in so many ways. You can find us at www.practicalbioethics.org. To our donors, grantors, contractors, constituents, colleagues, all, thank you. Stay well. Hope to see you again. Goodbye.
Thank you.